everyone for being here this morning. It's great to see such a big turnout. I see everyone's interested in evaluating their co-requisite support courses. So I am Mallory Newell. I am the Director of Institutional Research and Planning at De Anza College, and then also the Project Director for the Multiple Measures Assessment Project. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Gio. You want to introduce yourself, Gio?
Sure. Morning, everybody. My name is Gio Sosa. I am the Dean of Institutional Effectiveness at Crafton Hills College and a member, of course, of the Multiple Measures Assessment Project team as well. Good to be here.
Great. So we are recording this session. We will post this and the notes on the Multiple Measures Assessment Project website, and I can link to that in just a minute. I do want to say that we are running this as a meeting. So you are able to take yourself off mute. If you have a question, raise your hand, we'll call on you, or you can put questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat for Gio as we go. We did make this one an hour and a half so that we can have time for a lot of discussion. And we'll walk you through the process and then leave it open for a lot of discussion.
So here you have, I suppose, the obvious here. These are the things that we're hoping, in part, you can walk away with, given your time here with us this morning. We'll spend the time after Mallory provides us with a brief overview of AB 1705 and its implications as it relates to this work. We'll spend some time just so that we're all on the same page in terms of defining what we mean by co-requisite support. We'll spend also some time identifying maybe not a comprehensive set, but at least what I would describe as a key set of outcomes that you ought to be mindful of at your college as you begin doing this type of work. And also we'll have an eye here towards equity. And I suppose we would all, maybe all of us would agree here, this is very much at the heart of why we do this kind of work. And so we'll share with you a model that will help you explore issues related to equity gaps or issues maybe more specifically related to disproportionate impact as you do this kind of work. And of course, maybe to an extent at the heart of why we're here is to be able to derive conclusions that we can have confidence in, derive conclusions about this work that are ones that limit the extent to which we observe bias. So conclusions that have validity, conclusions that have reliability, that have integrity to them. And that, of course, will very much be the cornerstone of our discussion today.
Great, thank you. So how does this work, so our co-requisite work, kind of fit into AB 705 and now more recently AB 1705? And so 1705 was pretty explicit on the role of concurrent support. It's really trying to encourage colleges to use concurrent support or co-requisite support, and we'll define that meaning, but it's a support course that is linked to a transfer level math or English course. And so they're really trying to encourage colleges to be using these concurrent supports as an alternative to transfer level, pre-transfer level preparatory classes. So, we're moving away from these basic skills courses or remedial coursework and moving that support into these co-requisite supports. And it's really for a particular group of students, right? It's the students with the weaker high school math preparation or those with the lowest high school GPA. So if you're using the default placement rules or the GPA bands, it's those students in the lowest and middle bands that these co-requisite support courses are to be tailored for. And then also, given that there is a lot of research, both state and national research, that shows that co-requisite remediation is helping students be successful in these courses when compared to the prior way of doing things with the prerequisite remediation. The Chancellor's Office is saying that colleges should be validating their co-requisite support courses, but they're not required to do that. So the Chancellor's Office isn't going to be collecting your validation work, but it's encouraging colleges to continue to validate so that there's this continuous improvement of the co-requisite support courses. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So the recent AB 1705 guidance that came out from the Chancellor's office from Vice Chancellor Aisha Lowe talks a little bit about co-requisite support courses or concurrent support. And it just really reiterates that it's for those students who need that extra academic support at the transfer level. And it also, 1705 also says that, colleges may require students. So colleges were always able to require it, but it just really reiterates the fact that colleges can require concurrent support for students in the lowest and the middle GPA bands if it is determined that it will help support those students' completion. And so that's why this evaluation needs to come in to make sure that your course is helping those students in the lowest and middle GPA bands improve their completion of the transfer level courses. And then the guidance memo goes on to say that colleges may require enrollment for students, again, in the lowest GPA bands with the lowest high school preparation, or those students who have not previously completed that prerequisite coursework and who you think would benefit from those groups. So I can upload that guidance memo, and there's also a really nice FAQ that accompanied the guidance memo that may be helpful as well. So I'll go ahead and throw those in the chat as well.
All right. Thank you, Mallory, for that intro. Now we're going to get into some of those objectives that I was alluding to earlier. Let's start with, and I think Mallory did just a wonderful intro, and I recognize too, just given our audience, many of you are probably quite familiar with what we're talking about here with respect to concurrent or co-requisite support. But we thought, just for the sake of us all being on the same page here, to give you a visual illustration of what we're talking about. And again, I recognize many of you have a good handle on what exactly it is we're talking about, but just so that we're on the same page. What you see here on the top portion here is what often in the literature is referred to as a prerequisite model. This is where as in the state of California, what historically has been our approach to remediation, our approach to basic skills. And that is having students take a series, usually a series of basic skills or below transfer courses as they work their way up to that transfer level course. And usually, historically, that's been something you do on a term by term basis. I do recognize, of course, more recently, because of those acceleration efforts, a lot of colleges even move towards having those basic skills or below transfer level courses lumped together back to back in the context of one semester. But for the most part, I think this captures what historically we have been doing for many, many years, having students take those below transfer courses prior to reaching that transfer level mark. What you see at the bottom, however, is, and I think many of you will recognize this, is what we mean more specifically by the concurrent or the co-requisite approach here. What we have here is what I would more specifically label as a linked approach, one in which students have direct access in that very first term to that transferable course, and they're, as part of that enrollment, also asked to enroll in this co-requisite support that provides them with that just-in-time support that Mallory was alluding to, with that support that would otherwise be received prior to this in the context of those below transfer level courses. And this is something that we'll be coming back to throughout our session as well. I do also want to make the distinction between the co-requisite approach and the standalone model or the standalone approach, where students are enrolling directly in that transfer level course here in term one, but they don't have that co-requisite requirement tied to it. So it's a standalone transfer level course. And this I see honestly as the future of a lot of our work moving forward across the state, where we go, because so many of us have shifted away from the below transfer level offerings. Many of us probably already find ourselves in this position where we have students either in the co-rec experience or in the standalone experience. So we'll be spending a lot of our time also thinking about this particular comparison. The other piece I think was worth acknowledging, and you see this even in the verbiage here, the semantics, is the enhanced course model. So according to the Public Policy Institute of California, they have found, at least with respect to English as it comes to mind, that when looking at looking at the colleges offering concurrent support across the state community colleges more specifically, they found that it's 1 out of every 5 is offering some degree of enhanced courses. And so I do want to acknowledge that bit. And what we mean by enhanced is rather than having 2 separate courses, it's one course. Usually that one course is now not 3 units or 4 units, but a little bit beyond that, because those additional units are accounting for that remediation or that just-in-time support that those students are experiencing. So rather than having 2 separate but linked courses, this is one singular course that usually has a higher unit value than is typically associated with a math class, but it does so because it accounts for the additional curriculum that the students are experiencing in that class. So uh, our focus when we're talking about the comparison will usually be more tilted in favor of the linked approach because so many of us are adopting the linked approach. But I do want to acknowledge there is this enhanced model as well. And many of the strategies that Mallory and I will be sharing with you, quite honestly, transfer across the 2 approaches here. So don't feel like, oh, this is only applicable to linked. This is very much applicable also to this enhanced course model. So let's talk briefly about the outcomes here. I did mention earlier, this is not meant to be completely exhaustive, encompassing of all the possible outcomes, but I think most of us would agree this is a good sampling to start off with. And in part, I like this because this is encompassing of, and you see this with the very first one, the one outcome, maybe the outcome that the state chancellor's office has places particular emphasis on, throughput rates, but also encompassing of other outcomes that should be part of the discussion at your college when you're thinking about what is the impact of our co-rec offerings on student outcomes. So let's start with, let's just work away from top to bottom, throughput rates. Throughput rates is probably the term that arguably maybe you're most familiar with at this point as you reflect back on your knowledge of AB 1705 and earlier, of course, with respect to AB 705. Throughput rates, and you see the definition here, success in a transfer level course within 1 year of starting in that respective subject. So you have a student that enrolls, for instance, in math, and then you examine whether they are able then to complete that transfer level math requirement within that first year of enrolling in that first math course. Now you see the key piece here is that 1 year period. Now, obviously, you can examine whether that's a 1-term period, in which case it would be a 1-term throughput rate or a 2-year throughput rate. But for the most part, the definition that we are focusing on is that 1-year throughput rate. That is what number, what percentage of our students are completing that transfer level requirement within that first year of enrolling in that subject, be it math or be it English. And I did include a link. I don't know that we have the time, maybe we do, the time to pivot and talk about that wonderful transfer level gateway dashboard that a MAP member team member Loris Fagioli from Irvine College put together for us. I think it's a wonderful tool. Mallory, do you think we have time to just dip into that one, just in case there are folks that are not familiar with it?
Sure, I can queue it up real quick and I'll put the link
Let's see.
in.
Yeah, if you don't mind. So I'm gonna exit. I have it up.
Oh, go for it. Yeah, switch on
Yes,
over.
I
I'll put a
have it
link
up.
in.
Just briefly, obviously, someone like Loris and probably folks in the audience really have a more finer understanding of it, even than I do. But I think this is just a wonderful tool that is applicable to all of us. Of course, what we're looking at here at the moment is statewide information so that you can see those throughput rates and that change in those throughput rates over time across the state. But arguably, maybe I'm thinking selfishly about my college, and maybe you are with respect to your college, you can use the functionality built into this dashboard to look at data for your particular college. The piece that I find particularly helpful for me personally in my college is the regional view tab. So I'm going to click on that one. The regional view, as the term implies, allows you to look at data for a particular region. So I'm going to pick my region here. Bear with me here as it loads. And you see, when you identify your region, now, of course, your college, I'm from Crafton Hills, our college will be identified along with all of the other colleges that belong to that particular region. And you can examine what those transfer level completion rates or throughput rates are across all the colleges in your district. And you have this great functionality here that allows you to, here by default, we have English selected, but of course you can select math instead. And you have these other options here. Earlier, for instance, I talked about that time frame. And so for the most part, our standard in the state is that 1 year. You see that that's selected by default. But of course, you can change that. You can make that a 1-term throughput rate or a 2-year throughput rate, or 3 for that matter. And you can examine then those changes across, in this case, the region, or if you're inclined, across the state, or probe more specifically into your college. The last piece I'll mention here before I go on, because we will talk about equity gaps in a moment, is you can also, as you see here, look at those very data and identify groups that are disproportionately impacted across all of those colleges. So of course, I'm looking at Crafton Hills, and you can see here, we have groups that are disproportionately impacted, but I can also see what challenges exist in our region. And the value I see to this is, not only do I see the potential equity gaps at my college, but when we do regional work, and there's a lot of regional work that takes place in my region, I'm sure in yours as well, there's a lot of potential here. There's a lot of possibility here for collaboration as we do that linked work across our region. So I'll stop there, just because I'm mindful of the time, and we do have quite a bit of items that we'd like to get to. But please know, this is a wonderful resource, and should you have questions about it, I am very confident someone at your college, maybe your research folks, have a real fine understanding of how this works. Please go to those folks for additional guidance, but don't hesitate to reach out to someone like me or to Mallory should you have additional questions you think we can help with as well. So I'm going to pivot back to the slide deck here. Okay, let me go back here just to briefly acknowledge some of these other outcomes. Next, course success. This is another key piece that you ought to be mindful of. So if we think about say English, when we think about and examining that impact of co-requisite support. So the question that you want to ask yourself is, what is the impact of, for instance, a co-requisite model, and helping students not just complete that initial transfer level class, say, the English 1 or English 101, but what about the next one after that? What about critical thinking, that next course in the sequence? And of course, you can translate this over to math as well. What is the impact, more of a longer term impact, right? At that point, you're not just looking at completion transfer level, but what's that next course? And of course, we know that for many majors, there is that additional sequence that is required. So that's something for you to begin to factor in now as well. It's not just that first step. Of course, that's a critical step. That is a milestone. No question about it. And I know very much a gateway course for students. But let's start thinking now long term. What is that long term impact of that co-requisite support in terms of the likelihood that the student is able to succeed? Other outcomes, the one piece that comes to mind as I'm looking at the slide too is, and I should have probably included citations here, so I'm apologizing here as I'm looking at this. For all of the outcomes that you're seeing here, maybe with the exception of the 30-unit milestone, there are articles. There are articles out there, either ones that are specific to California or to other parts of the country, articles where authors have specifically examined these different kinds of outcomes in the context, of course, their population of students. So there are actual studies out there, published studies, that give you data here related to the impact of co-requisite offerings in relation to these different outcomes. Maybe the one I haven't seen is with respect to the 30-unit milestone. One that's not here, and I know I'm jumping around here, one that's not here that comes to mind is even with respect to wage or earnings. There's one study, and I can't think of the authors off the top of my head, but I know there's a study out there that specifically looked at not just award attainment, but even the long-term wages, and found a link, maybe not particularly strong one, but nevertheless a link between even that co-requisite exposure and the long-term earnings of those students that were presented with those types of offerings. These other outcomes are ones I know many of you are familiar. The idea of looking at the percentage of students that return. so that we can ensure that the students remain enrolled at our college. So they come to us in the fall and they also stay with us in the spring. Or they come, if you want to do a year-to-year persistence, they come to us in the fall and they're still enrolled with us come the following fall term or fall semester or fall quarter, whatever the case may be with you. And of course, a longer term outcome, in addition to the wage outcome that I alluded to earlier, would be award attainment and graduation. And with respect, as I said earlier, all of these outcomes, there has been found with respect to, it may be the exception of the 30-unit milestone, a positive relationship between the co-requisite exposure, that co-requisite experience, and the achievement or attainment of all of the outcomes that you see here, again, with the exception of the milestone. Let's talk a little bit about disaggregated data. This, of course, will get us to the discussion of equity gaps and disproportionate impact. This is, and I know many of you have an appreciation for this. This is very much at the heart of doing this work. And when you do any kind of assessment for effectiveness, be it co-requisite or gosh, just about anything you can think of with respect to your college, disaggregation should be very much at the heart of that work. So just so that we're all on the same page, and I recognize again, this is probably familiar to many folks, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I have a visual here that captures the essence of what we're talking about here. So when you identify an outcome like the one that we were just talking about earlier, throughput rate, what you often are inclined to do naturally is to look at the throughput rate for your entire campus. All students taking English, all students taking math, what is that overall throughput rate, say 1 year throughput rate for all of the students? And of course, you would look at that, just like maybe you would glean that from the dashboard that we were sharing earlier. Now, the next step, of course, should be to disaggregate the information. What do you mean by disaggregate? Well, look at that information by distinct student population. So in this case, in this example, we have those data disaggregated by gender. We have female students, we have throughput for male students, we have throughput for non-binary students. And it's in doing this work that you begin to get a handle on potential equity gaps that may exist between those populations of students. So you may have a situation where you have great throughput rates, dramatic increases in throughput rates, which is wonderful. We want that for our students. But when you disaggregate your data, and it doesn't have to be for gender, it could be for ethnicity, it could be for DSPS status, it could be for other special populations at your college. When you disaggregate your data, you may find that despite the increases that you're observing overall, which are wonderful, of course, there still remain gaps. There still remains work on your part, on our part to do to better support the students and ensure that all students truly are succeeding. And with that, I think that's a good pivot to what I hope you can see here still on the screen here with respect to this framework that highlights success versus success with equity. And these are hypothetical data. And in fact, many of the examples that I'll be sharing with you, not all, but many are in fact hypothetical in nature, but I think are very pertinent to any discussion having to do with assessing the impact of co-requisite support. Let's start with the one on the left here. So in this hypothetical scenario, we have here on the vertical or the y-axis the transfer rates to CSU and UC campuses, and of course on the horizontal or the x-axis we have the years, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. What I'd like for you to hone in on is that line going diagonally up. And what we want, of course, is for the transfer rates to increase, just like we would want for our throughput rates or for any outcome that we are mindful of with respect to assessing student success. We want those outcomes to increase over time. And that's in fact what's being denoted here with this line going diagonally from left to right. Those increases from year 1, where you see the rates are below 20%, and you see those rates increasing over time. Wonderful. What I want to now call your attention to is to those vertical bars with those notches. You see that? And for every year, for every point in time, those vertical bars are intended to reflect the variability that exists between students themselves or student populations. So for every year, you have increases in those success, but at the same time, you still have what I hope you can sort of visualize here with this diagram. You still have gaps that exist. We have students, say, let's say at year 2, students that are well above the average, which would be the line going from left to right, that are doing really well, which is wonderful. But we also have students down below here that are well below. And if we go from year 2 to year 3, we have overall increases, which is wonderful. But again, those gaps still persist. And in fact, what you can probably see or detect visually is that the gaps don't change. Even though the overall outcomes are increasing, the gaps between students remain the same. And so what I would describe, what you see here on the left, is success without equity. And this is critical, because it's tempting to think that, oh, we're achieving these wonderful outcomes, our work is done or nearly complete. But this again underscores the importance of disaggregating your data, because when you disaggregate your data and you look at those distinct populations, you realize quite quickly in doing this work, we still have work to do. There's a lot of work that we need to do to begin to bridge the gaps that still exist between our student populations. Let's transition then to this visual that you have here on the right. You note here, the axes are the same, and in fact, the overall rates, or the overall rates themselves as they go from left to right, they're the same between this chart and the chart here on the left. But what you see changing here are those gaps, those vertical bars here with those notches, they're shrinking over time. That means the gaps between students are also shrinking. And this is what I believe all of us are trying to achieve at our campuses, not just the success. We all want all of our students to achieve success, but we also specifically want to close the gaps that exist between those populations of students, so that we don't have a situation like what we see here on the left, where we still have students being left behind. Yes, all of the students are experiencing an increase in success, but it's not enough for these students down here at the bottom. These students down here on the left, they're not reaping the same benefits of the students up here. It's because they're lacking in those supports. And I don't want to dwell too much on that topic. I think that in and of itself is an entirely very much related but separate conversation, this idea of equity mindedness and thinking about structurally what are we lacking as colleges in terms of offering the supports that we need to help begin to see those improvements and those successful outcomes. But that really is at the heart of what we're trying to communicate here, that emphasis on equity, emphasis on changing the way we do things to better support the students. So especially after this session, you think, well, I need to look at our disaggregated data. We need to pay closer attention to it. And throughput rates, that's something we really need to prioritize at our college. And so you say to yourself, I'm going to disaggregate our data, and I'm going to look at throughput rates by ethnicity. And let's say in doing that, and you see, well, our throughput rates for Black African American students are 5%. Okay. And so you might be wondering, what do I do with that? Is that good? Is that not good? Well, one thing for you to consider is, what is the relative representation of Black African American students in your entire student population? And so let's say you do that and you find, well, across your entire college, your entire student population, 10% of those students are Black African American. Well, 10%, if 10% of your entire population identifies Black African American, then it stands to reason, right, that when you look at those that are achieving throughput, those that are transferring, those that are graduating, whatever outcome in question it is that you're examining, that there's a match, right? So if 10% of our students are Black African American, then when we look at the successful outcomes, then 10% of those students also should be Black African American. But in your scenario, in this hypothetical scenario, there's a mismatch. And it's in that context that we say there's a disproportionate impact, because when we look at the successful outcomes, those students are the percentage there is far lower than the expectation. You expect there to be a match, right? So when we look at the percentage of students within the successful population, it's 5%. And we look at the representation overall, it's 10%. And you take a ratio of those two numbers, and of course the ratio, the is a value of 0.5, half of what you expect. When there's a match, of course, if you take a ratio of those numbers, that value is 1. And you see that reflected here in the form, and before I even get to the chart here in the middle, what you see here in the upper right-hand corner, we have the proportion of students in the outcome or the successful outcome relative to the proportion of the students overall or the entire cohort of students. When you look again, the proportion of those in this hypothetical example, those students in the outcome group, the throughput outcome group, 0.5, you divide those by those students overall. If that ratio isn't something very close to 1, that's consistent with the idea of a disproportionate impact. Now, I'm going to more or less stop with the discussion of disproportionate impact there. But of course, there is a link here in the slides to a document that the MAP team has put together and revised more recently, and one that we think does a pretty decent job of covering all of these concepts in question, and certainly proportionality index, which is what we're talking about here, being one of those topics. Now that I hope we're more or less on the same page with respect to the topic here at hand, what I'd like for you to now consider are the data that you see here. So what we're looking at here, and this is a hypothetical example, but one, honestly, that you may uncover in doing this kind of work at your college. What we're looking at here are the PI values, or the proportionality index values, stemming from those throughput rates. And this is comparing standalone courses, and I shared with you that would be one of the emphasis here, standalone courses versus the co-requisite courses by ethnicity. So I know there's a lot going on here, but I hope together here we can piece this together. So when we're looking at PI values, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking for values that are at 1. So if the value is at 1, then the percentages, the 2 percentages that we talked about earlier, match, right? So in the hypothetical example from earlier, if 10% of your student population identifies Black African American, and then when you look at just those that achieve throughput, also 10%, well, 10 divided by 10 is 1, right? So we would have a PI value of 1. So values close to 1 or equal to 1 are good. Values that fall below 1 are ones that should be concerning. And generally speaking, when you conduct that work, when you calculate that PI value, there's a cutoff that you should be mindful of. Anything that is at that 0.85 or lower should be concerning to you. Anything that is at 0.8 or below should be very concerning to you. So bearing that in mind, let's have a look at our data here. Let's start with Hispanic Latinx students. You can see, and of course, the darker shading, to go back to our legend here, the darker shading is with respect to the standalone courses, and the lighter shading is with respect to the co-requisite courses. So let's start with Hispanic Latinx students. The darker shading, again, with standalone courses. The throughput rates for those students in those standalone courses is matching their representation in that population. So let's say this is a hypothetical example from my college. This would mean that the percentage of students that identify Hispanic Latinx among the throughput population matches more or less their representation in my college as a whole. And when we do the same thing for the co-rec students, we're finding very similar findings. This is good. This is great. So for Hispanic Latinx students in this example, let's say at my college, this is great news. We're not seeing any evidence consistent with an equity gap for Hispanic Latinx students. Now let's look at Black African American students. Now, for standalone courses, look at that PI value. That is very low. That is incredibly low. So that means there's a clear mismatch between those that the representation of Black African American students among those achieving that successful outcome relative to their representation in the population overall. This is a clear indicator that these students are not being well served. Now, let's look at, of course, now the PI value for the co-requisite courses among Black African American. You can see it's increased. It's not 1. We want it to be 1, right? When we see values of 1, that means there's a match. That's a great thing. When we see values below 1, we're concerned, but you can see here the difference in the PI value. It's increased. This here is evidence of closing of gaps. This here is consistent with the notion that co-requisite support, and I recognize it is a hypothetical example, but one that you may encounter. This would be consistent with the conclusion that co-requisite support is serving to close the equity gap itself. Yes, there's still work to do. 0.87 is not 1. We want it to be 1. It's not 1. There's still work to do, but certainly goes a long way in closing those gaps. And research folks would say this would be consistent with the elimination of the disproportionate impact. Similarly, you have Pacific Islander students here. We have a very low PI value. One, frankly, I saw this at my college, I would say this is unacceptable. We have a lot of work to do, but you can see when those students enroll in those co-requisite supports, look at what happens to that PI value. Marvelous. So you might encounter, and I think this is a real possibility, you might encounter evidence showing that co-requisite support or other interventions, quite frankly, that you engage at your college show a closing of gaps, or in some cases, like what you see in this example, of complete elimination of that gap. You have here, and this is also possible too, I admit, we have here for Native American or American Indian students, we have an increase of the gap. This is not a good thing. This is going in the wrong direction. We already have a gap here to begin with of 0.81, but then that gap only becomes larger with the intervention. This is possible, and this is something, of course, you want to be mindful of, but again, just being mindful of this notion of how the gaps themselves can change on the basis of the intervention in question. So now the last piece, and really I touched upon this earlier, maybe to some extent, maybe the focus of our session here is to really take the time to reflect on what it means to conduct these kinds of comparisons. So in this case, and I shared this earlier, the focus is on comparing standalone courses to co-requisite model support courses. And so when you do that, you want to make sure that you're mindful of what you see here, conducting what we refer to in many settings as an apples to apples comparison. What we want more specifically is that when we conduct the comparison, that there is, to the extent possible, an equivalence between the two groups, such that to the extent possible, the only thing that differs between them is that one had co-requisite support and the other one didn't. If there are other factors at play, those other factors may be, in fact, accounting for the differences between the groups. That is something that all of us, whether you're a researcher or not, you need to be mindful. If you're a researcher, certainly you're the one probably doing a lot of this work. You want to be especially sensitive to it. But even if you're not, if you're in this room, there's a really good chance that you're a decision maker. You're part of those discussions. You help to influence the work at your college. You need to be mindful of that too. You need to be mindful of asking those types of questions. To what extent do we have an apples to apples comparison? To what extent do we have equivalence between the two groups that we're comparing? And I'll share with you, actually, as I'm saying that, a story comes to mind. Many years ago, I think it's okay, I say this, I'm gonna go for it. Many years ago, EOPS program came to me and said, do you mind looking at successful outcomes between our students in EOPS versus the non-EOPS or the rest of the population? And I took a quick glance. I wasn't really spending too much time. I just wanted to see what are the differences. I think at that point it was with respect to course success rates. And I looked at and I found something startling, at least to me, startling. The success rates were really low. The course success rates were really low in EOPS relative to the rest of the campus as a whole. And it was really concerning to me. But I gave it some thought, and I came to this same conclusion: apples to apples, apples to apples. And I realized, and like many of us probably do on the call here, we need to acknowledge that we're talking about two different EOPS populations, quite distinct. One factor that became readily apparent to me in looking at the data was the GPA of those students. The GPA, or the overall preparedness of those students, was very different between the EOPS population and the campus as a whole. when in fact I controlled for existing GPA, I controlled for past coursework, when I then limited the comparison group to just those students that had similar GPAs, to just those students that had similar backgrounds, be it with respect to income, be it with respect to ethnicity and other factors, when I had what I would describe as a closer to an apples to apples comparison, in fact, I saw a significant advantage to the EOPS success rate relative to that comparison group. So that, I hope, helps to highlight the issue at hand. It isn't just comparing one group or one type of approach to the other. It's being sensitive to working towards establishing some degree of equivalence between those two groups before you proceed with that comparison. And one key factor, even in my example, but one key factor, most certainly, you want to be mindful of when you're doing this kind of work tied to co-requisite support is GPA, high school GPA in particular. There is so much work out there. I have one citation here, but there are still many articles and studies and examples, maybe even at your college, showing the strong linkage between high school GPA and the likelihood of completing that transfer level coursework, i.e. throughput rate. And we have a citation here. I should put a hyperlink to the article. Maybe we can do that with Mallory's help. This bar study is a wonderful study, also done in collaboration with many MAP team members. Wonderful study that really shines a light on the importance of being mindful of high school GPA and ascertaining those outcomes. Of course, and you saw this with the example earlier that I just shared with respect to EOPS. Other demographic characteristics are also very important when you're considering. So high school GPA, maybe you should put at the top of your list, but be mindful of other factors as well. So what you have here, of course, is you probably can glean for yourself, is a visual depiction of what we're talking about here. So we have students enrolling in math, students enrolling in English. And of course, in this framework, some of those are going directly into that standalone course. Some of those instead are going to the core requisite support, usually into that linked scenario that we described to you earlier. So you want to be mindful of, again, being mindful of having that apples to apples comparison. And one way you can do that, we're going to talk to some length about this now, is by being mindful of the corresponding GPAs that each group holds, or the interval, the GPA band that each group of students is in, so that when you're conducting this comparison, you have, say, in both groups, a comparison that is limited to, say, those students that have X GPA, or those students that fall within the particular GPA band. Let's say it's those students that have a GPA less than 1.9, less than 2.0, less than 2.5, so that then you can have closer to an apples to apples comparison. That is critical, given, again, what I said earlier concerning the literature showing consistently high school GPA is a very strong predictor of that success in college, and certainly with respect to those throughput rates. Now, what we're looking at are actual data. These are not hypothetical. These are actual data across our entire state. What you're looking at is first attempt in English by high school GPA. So you see down, let me point before we get into the details of it, what you see here on the X axis, or the horizontal axis, we have students with high school GPAs less than 1.9, those between 1.91 and 259, and those that are equal to or greater than 2.6. Now, what we're looking at here, excuse me, what we're looking at here are the percentage of those students by, again, that experience, whether they're enrolling in below transfer, whether that first attempt, that first enrollment in English is in below transfer, whether that first attempt is in a co-requisite linked course, right, as we've talked about in the past, or whether that's just in that standalone transfer enrollment. Now, have a look for yourself and see if you can see the pattern here. Let's start here on the left. So 24% of those students that enrolled in below transfer had a GPA less than 1.9. You see it, not that far behind, 20% of the co-requisite students also had a GPA less than 1.9. Look at the change though. Standalone, those students enrolling in standalone, they were not likely to have such a GPA. This is also sharing something with you. This has to do with what we're talking about here about establishing equivalence. Let's go on to the next band, 1.91, 2.59. 40% of the below transfer enrollment, they were between that range. 41%, very similar again, of the co-requisite students were also within that range. But you see now less representation among those in standalone. Let's look at the final band here. 36% of those students in the enrolling and below transfer were in that GPA band, 39% for co-rec, but look, much more for the standalone. This probably, you're thinking to yourself, why are you dwelling? This is obvious, and maybe it is, but I think this is an important consideration on your part when you're doing this kind of work, when you're conducting these kinds of comparisons. We can see here that generally speaking, the co-rec student, as it relates to GPA, the co-rec student is quite similar to the below transfer student. See that? Their GPAs seem to parallel, and that's partly because, in many ways, co-rec support is how our new approach in the state, our new approach to contending with the challenges associated with remediation. Co-rec is what used to be our basic skills approach. Those students that would otherwise be enrolling in that prerequisite model that we talked about earlier are now more than ever enrolling in co-requisite support. That's partly why you see such similarities here in their representation across those bands. But you see, importantly, the distinction between those groups and the GPAs of those enrolling in standalone. So that is something, again, not to beat a dead horse, as they say, something critical for your consideration, particularly if you're comparing those that are in standalone versus those in prerequisite. This suggests that there are market differences in their GPAs, and that's something you want to be very sensitive to as you conduct this kind of work. Here you have those same data, but not by GPA, but now by race ethnicity. Have a moment here while I take a little break here to gloss over these data points. So if you're like me, you look at this, and what I have in circles here probably grabbed your eye immediately, because we have 58 and 55%, for instance. Let's focus in on Hispanic Latinx. 58, 55% in of the below transfer and co-rec are Hispanic Latinx. Again, very similar, but you see less or lower value, I should say, when you focus just on the standalone. And in contrast, when we look at our white students, they're less likely to be in below transfer and co-requisite, more likely to be in standalone. So just as maybe another background in terms of a statistic to bear in mind, I would say and I looked at this the day or two ago, if you look at our statewide data on Datamart, you'll find, at least for the academic year 1920, about 46% of all of our students were Hispanic Latinx, approximately 46. For white students, that was closer to about 23, between 23 and 24%. So bear that in mind, because that even relates to this issue of equity gaps, or relates to this issue of proportionality index. So when we're looking at these data, we have greater, more than what we would expect in terms of students enrolling and below transfer and co-requisite, because I shared with you earlier, that was roughly 46, 47%. 58, 55% is a representation in below transfer and co-requisite. And for white students, their overall representation in our state for that academic year was between 23 and 24%. You see, their rates differ from that, at least slightly. They're overrepresented, you could argue, in the standalone course, underrepresented in the co-rec or the below transfer piece. So I don't want to go off on a tangent, but something for you to dwell on as well as you think about this. Maybe the broader point, more specifically tied to what we're doing here, is this, I hope, highlights again Even with respect to factors beyond high school GPA, there are other factors like race, ethnicity that also are central to the work that you do here. And there are also factors that you need to be mindful of to the extent possible, mitigating, so that then when you're looking at those outcomes, be it throughput rates or next course success or whatever outcome it is that you focus in on at your college, you are mindful of accounting for these types of factors. And so you might be thinking to yourself, and I'll come back to this and with greater detail. How do we do that? What does that look like? I'll come back. I promise. I'll come back to that in a moment. Here is one other graphic that I wanted to highlight for you. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, oh, I forgot to add a note here. So I'll verbalize it for you because I think it's an important piece to add. What we're looking at here are these are not hypothetical. These are real data. These are actual data provided to us by the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC. And you have, of course, this is very much center to our conversation here in a comparison between standalone courses and the co-requisite courses. What you have here are the one term, that's important too, the one term throughput rates for those two sets of students. 63% for the standalone, 53% for the co-rec. There's a gap in favor of standalone. But one important thing to consider, and this is what I was alluding to earlier, I think it's important to acknowledge, the authors acknowledge this, and they do a fine job. They go to great pains in acknowledging this. The authors did not take into account high school GPA. They didn't have access to those data, unfortunately. So what you're seeing here is, one might argue, and I would count myself as one of those folks, not a true apples to apples comparison because you're not taking into account a key factor in all this, which is that high school GPA that students had coming into this experience. So yes, here, when you just look at that difference, well, you would believe the standalone is far superior than co-requisite, and that may still be the case. That may still be what you uncover at your college. But when you don't control for something like high school GPA, you're not doing yourself any favors because you need to account for that influence before you can say with greater confidence one intervention is working relative to another.
And Gio, while you're just letting your voice rest, Jim, the last slide from PPIC, do you know if that was the math or English that they're
Oh,
referring
thank
to?
you. English. Sorry about that. English. Thank you. So I think what you have here is more or less a synopsis of what we have been talking about. That is to be mindful of that GPA, be mindful of controlling for that GPA band. And if you're in the session, you're thinking, I'm not sure what that looks like. I'm gonna get into some detail. I'm gonna get into some detail of what that looks like, but be rest assured, if you're not fully comfortable, even after our session, fully comfortable with what this entails, I know there's someone at your college, usually the research folks, but maybe not just the research folks. You might have data coaches and other folks that are just data savvy that can walk you through this process. So please know there's someone at your campus that can offer you additional guidance with respect to what this looks like in practice at a more granular level. So as I said earlier, I think this is a good synopsis of what we've been talking about. You want to be mindful of controlling for the GPA band when you're conducting that comparison. So you saw in the earlier graphic where I disaggregated the data for you by band. That would be a great starting point for determining those differences, looking at the difference, say, between standalone and co-requisite support within GPA, the lowest GPA band, within the next GPA band, and of course, within the next GPA band, and so on and so forth. Then you have something closer to an apples to apples comparison. And of course, you want to be mindful of, in addition to controlling for these factors, have an eye towards what the impacts are on reducing potential gaps, as you saw, of course, in that earlier graphic. So it's not just showing that the intervention is effective. That's good. That's a wonderful starting point. But you need to ask yourself, to what extent is it closing gaps for particular populations at our campus, particularly the ones, maybe the ones that you've identified in your recent equity plan, or other DI, disproportionately impacted groups that exist at your college. Now, what I'll be walking or trying to walk you through here, something that honestly applies to any kind of outcome. We've highlighted throughput here because I see that, and I think you might agree that is maybe the principal outcome here when we're talking about the impact of co-requisite support. But certainly isn't the only one, as we talked about it as well earlier. Now, I'd like you to focus in on the left side. For the moment, block out everything on the right. Let's focus in just on the left-hand side here. Stop for a moment and think about all the factors that likely affect or do affect the throughput rates or among the students that you serve at your college. What are all the factors? And I mean all the factors. I don't just mean the type of coursework that they took. I don't just mean their GPA. Literally everything. I mean, this could include what students had for breakfast the day before a big exam. It could be the number of units that they're enrolled in overall. It could be the number of work hours that they have. It could be anything. And I'm sure we could spend the rest of, how much time do we have? The rest of the 30 minutes that we have together as a group coming up with factor after factor after factor after factor, all of which are very much related to whether a student achieves this milestone or not. Now, bearing that in mind, what I want you to think about now, again, I'm asking you to block out what you see on the right, just what you see on the left here. What I'd like for you to think about is or consider is the application of that example to what you're seeing here in this circle. So in this circle, what you see me trying to depict to you are all of the factors, that affect the likelihood of whether a given student achieves that throughput. And as each of us were to spend that time thinking about all of these variables, all of these considerations, all of these factors, we'd begin to chip away. All of these factors that we can come up with together would gradually, one after the other, cut in to the circle to such a point that over time, in coming up with all of these factors, we would have a handle as to how all of these factors come together to, in fact, have the effect on the throughput rate. So I probably should have included a visual to highlight that, but imagine as you come up with each of these factors in your mind and as part of our discussion, imagine each one overlapping to some extent with the throughput rate circle and accounting for one of the reasons why throughput even exists. Now, bearing that in mind, now I want you to look at what you see on the right. What you see on the right is a depiction of some of those factors. And of course, this is hypothetical. These are not actual findings, but these are the types of findings that you, in fact, may uncover. And yeah, I know your research folks have a sense for how this works and probably do a better job than I can in explaining this to you. What you see on the right here is the influence of those types of factors in relation to explaining throughput. Remember, that's what we started off with. What are the factors that explain throughput? What are the factors that can account for why someone achieves throughput or does not? So what you see on the right now is a hypothetical depiction of what those possible factors are and the extent to which they seem to explain the likelihood of whether someone achieves throughput or does not. And so we have here 4 different factors. Actual co-requisite support, which of course is very much at the heart of why we're here, why we're having this discussion. We have high school GPA, another critical factor. We have ethnicity. We have special population status, such as EOPS, for instance. And the degree to which, and I think this is important, the degree to which, say, ethnicity, the degree to which the ethnicity circle overlaps with a throughput circle is then intended to be a depiction of how strongly those 2 variables are correlated, right? So we can see with ethnicity and special population, the degree of relationship or correlation is very similar. So we would say those 2 factors are about equally related to the likelihood of someone achieving throughput. Let's change our focus here to co-requisite support in GPA. You can see each one of those in this hypothetical example actually is more strongly related to throughput rate. So they have a stronger influence on whether someone achieves throughput rate. And that's what I'm trying to show here. And that's in fact what your work at your college may help you uncover. Whether, for instance, co-requisite support and high school GPA are more strongly associated with the likelihood of throughput compared to ethnicity, compared to special population status, and compared to any other information that you have access to for your students and that you can examine statistically. Now, I'll stop here and I'll say what I've been explaining to you, trying to explain to you, are really the foundations to statistical modeling. So when folks at your college, researchers, probably most likely like me, say, we developed a statistical model to examine the relationship here, or we developed, they might say things like, we developed a regression model to understand the influence or the impact of co-requisite support. What they're telling you is what I'm trying to explain to you here. This visualization, I think, to some extent, adequately captures what they're communicating to you. So hope you remember this conversation in the future when they come to you with this modeling work and they explain things to you. Really, at the heart of it is what we're covering here together. And so again, to come back to this, you can see the co-requisite in this visualization, co-requisite support in high school GPA seem to have a stronger influence on throughput than ethnicity and special population status. The other bit that I want to highlight is you see that, of course, high school GPA and co-requisite support both correlate strongly with throughput, but look, they also correlate with themselves. They're also related to each other. What this is saying is your high school GPA also has some bearing on whether you receive co-requisite support. And that makes sense, right? That's true, because at many of our colleges, whether students are asked to take co-requisite is tied to that high school GPA. If it's below a certain threshold, we say you need co-requisite support. So it makes sense that there would be a relationship, and that's what's being depicted for you here. The last thing, or at least one of the last things I want to say, is bearing in mind here the comparison between co-rec and high school GPA. Again, bearing in mind that overlap between those two factors, we can then say the shaded part here, not the overlapping part. So this part, I hope you can see my cursor here. This part here on the right here for co-requisite support, that would be the unique contribution that co-requisite support has in understanding the likelihood that someone achieves throughput. You see that? That's important. The unique contribution. This relationship that's not overlapping with high school GPA is the unique and that's critical. It's not confounded. It's not biased by other factors, at least in this scenario. It's that unique relationship that it has with throughput after taking into account other factors that you have access to in your data. Similarly, of course, for high school GPA, when you consider just the portion that it overlaps with throughput, that's not also overlapping with co-rec. So this part, hopefully you can see my cursor. This portion here, that's the unique relationship that high school GPA has with throughput. These are the kinds of things that you should be mindful of when you're doing your work. Not just what's the correlation between co-rec support and throughput. That's a good question. And most certainly that's a good starting point. But what you really want to ask yourself is, what is the unique, after removing all of the other factors, the other variables, like high school GPA, ethnicity, special population status, what is that unique relationship that co-requisite has with throughput? Now, in doing this kind of work, one of the, I was debating this morning. I thought, should I really go into this? I'm going to go there. And I may not do a fine job of explaining this to you, but I think it's important for not just those of us that do research, but for all of us in some way, shape, or form, have not just access to data, but are decision makers. All of us are, to some extent, all of us are or trying to be equity practitioners at our college. And it's important that we all have a finer understanding of some of these data literacy components so that we can leverage that knowledge and, of course, applying corresponding strategies to bridge equity gaps or to otherwise enhance the student experience at our college. So that's generally my philosophy, and that's why I'm going to try my best to explain this next piece to you. So when you do this kind of approach, so let's go back to there. This, and I suppose I said this earlier, this would result from a statistical model, one that's often referred to as a regression approach. So you may hear that terminology at your campus. When you do an approach like or conduct an approach like that, one of the statistical findings that may result from that is what's called an odds ratio. You see that down here. I should have put it more prominently up top. An odds ratio. An odds ratio, so I'll just think about this, and this might be topical for all of us in the state. If I ask you, what are the odds that it's going to rain today? Well, I live in Southern California, and I know we have folks here from Northern California. So for us in the South, maybe the odds are a little bit lower, but in the last 3 months, boy, those odds have been high that it's going to rain. So I would say for me, just my personal experience here where I live in the city of Yucaipa, which is just the foothills of the San Bernardino Mountains. So for me, I would say the odds that it's going to rain on any given day, probably 1 in 3. So for every 3 days, one of those days is going to be a rainy day. So I would say then 1 divided by 3, odds are that it's 0.33. That's the chance that it's going to rain today. What that means, of course, is the odds that it's not going to rain are 0.67, right? So for every 3 days, 1 day it rains, 2 days it doesn't rain. 2 divided by 3, 0.67. So 0.67 that it's not going to rain, 0.33 that it is going to rain. Now, take those numbers. I should have put a visual here. I apologize now that I'm talking through. Now take a ratio of those numbers. 0.67 divided by 0.33. Feel free to grab your calculator or your phone and do it. That value would be almost exactly 2. So what does that mean? That, in fact, is an odds ratio. That's an odds ratio illustrating to you the likelihood of it raining relative to not raining. In this case, because our value is 2, we are 2 times more likely to experience rain than not, or excuse me, 2 times more likely to experience a dry day relative to a rainy day. That would be the interpretation of that odds ratio. And I go to some extent in explaining that logic because, in fact, and many researchers have a sense for this, a good sense for this. You can take statistics like the odds ratio to generate what you actually see here in this table. You can use the odds ratio as a starting point for identifying what the expected successes will be among your students moving forward. So you're not just thinking retrospectively, what are our data saying? What are these data say? This is a relationship, that is a. So you can take that information, your historical data, and now think prospectively. Given what we know now, given, say, the odds ratio associated with the unique relationship of co-requisite support, what does that mean moving forward? What does that mean for this incoming cohort of students that we'll be serving next semester or next term? You can take that odds ratio and create a table akin to what you see on the screen here. And for those of you, including researchers, I'm happy. I should have put a link to a great document that walks you through this. So maybe with Mallory's help, we'll share that out as well. So now, given the odds ratio, and this is, of course, a hypothetical example, given an odds ratio of 1.45, and you're just gonna have to take my word for it. I'm not gonna dwell too much into that. Maybe going too far into the deep end here with statistics. Just take my word for it. 1.45 is not a particularly large impact. It's still meaningful. Most statisticians would agree it's still meaningful, but it's modest. It's a modest impact. So let's suppose in your world, when you do this work, you uncover an odds ratio of 1.45. Again, a very, very modest effect, but still one in favor of core requisite support. So you might ask yourself, what does that look like? Because if you were to take this, whether you're a researcher, you're a data coach, or whomever, you're a decision maker, you're an equity practitioner, you might take this to your equity committee and say, we found an odds ratio 1.45. There's a good chance people will look at you and think, so what? What does that mean? Is that good? Is that not good? Is that very good? This chart is, in my view, a great way to at least open that dialogue, open the conversation. Take a number that on its face just is a random number. to translating it into something that's more tangible, more concrete to the layperson, to someone that may not have the skills that you now have, and even knowing what an odds ratio is and how to calculate it. So if you were to take an odds ratio, again, at 1.45, and you were to say, okay, let's suppose these findings still hold for our college moving forward. What does that mean? Well, let's say for 200 students, and I know many of us serve more than 200, but I wanted to keep this simple. You can multiply this by however many students you serve, and you can change this accordingly. But I think the simplified version still does a nice job of communicating the point. So let's say for 200 students that you serve, for every 200 students that you serve, let's suppose half of them enrolled in co-requisite support and half of them went to standalone transfer level. So 100 are in co-req, as you see here, 100 are in standalone. What will be those throughput rates? What will be those successful outcomes in one group versus the other, assuming an odds ratio of 1.45? Now, assuming that very modest odds ratio, what you would find for 100 students in the standalone, you would find half of them were successful, and the other half were not. Look at the co-requisite support, 55-45 split. There's an advantage of 5 students. So just as a result of the co-requisite support alone, because we know this is a unique relationship, we talked about that earlier, just the co-requisite support, this suggests, co-requisite support will result for every 200 students, an increase of 5 additional students that would not have otherwise achieved that success. That's critical. This is just out of 200 students, and this is, and trust me, very modest odds ratio. There are odds ratios. I've seen odds ratios of 4 or 5 or 6. This is just 1.45. So even with a very modest odds ratio, you can see there's a discernible advantage in favor of the co-requisite support. Again, this is just 200 students. So you multiply that by how many students you have enrolling in math and English. And my college is probably around 1,200 students annually. So, and I'm at a smaller college. We serve fewer than 8,000 students per year. You at larger colleges, I mean, gosh, I can't even imagine what those figures are at your college. So you can easily translate this accordingly to get a sense for scale. Now, in my opinion, my humble view, something like this would more likely resonate with that committee, resonate with those other key stakeholders, as opposed to just giving them a 1.45 value and saying, that's not too big, it's not too small, it's just about right. This does, in my view, a better job of concretizing that notion, giving people concrete figures about what the true impact is of something like co-requisite support.
Thank you, Drew. I have been saving 3 questions for you, so we have about 15 minutes. So one that's super relevant to this slide. Can you just really quickly go back and walk us through how you got the from the 1.45 odds ratio to the 55 and the 45?
Excellent. So I don't have the formula here on hand, so that's part of the resource that I want to share with the group. But there's a way to, okay, I'm going to get into some of the granularity here. So I apologize for those of you for whom statistics is not something you live with or you think about often. So the odds ratio, for those that maybe are more statistically inclined, the odds ratio can be converted to an R value, a Pearson R value. It can also be converted to what's known as a Cohen's D. Those statistical metrics, many of you may know this, are all interchangeable. You can mathematically convert from one to the other to the other. So the process that I followed was converting this odds ratio to a corresponding mathematically equivalent Pearson R value. That corresponding Pearson R value then is what determines the splits that you see depicted in this diagram. So I will share with you, this is what I was alluding to earlier, I will share with you an article that specifically walks one through and offers all the formulas that would allow one to go from this step of the 145 to, of course, the split that you see in this graphic. That's a wonderful question. I'm sorry, I should have put a link here so that those of you that are interested could just tap on it and go on to that resource and have at it in terms of making sense of it.
Great, thank you. So then another great question came in around if a college was designing an evaluation themselves, and this is in particular for students who failed maybe the first time, the transfer level class the first time, and trying to see what would be most beneficial for them the next time. And so their question is, can we consider that as a band of students, regardless of their GPA, to study for co-requisite classes and then compare their throughput in their second pass in a class without co-requisites? And if you want to read it, it's just the third comment from the bottom if you look at your chat.
Okay, let me see that. Let me see that.
So it's kind of trying to just compare those students who fail to maybe a student who fails in a co-requisite compared to a student who fails not in a co-requisite with the same GPA band.
Oh, excellent. Oh, that last piece makes sense to me. So both parties have been non-successful and they're both already within the same band. Oh, that's a wonderful comparison because now you've already controlled for, with the band, controlled for preparedness. And now, of course, they have that shared outcome. So tracking them moving forward, I think is a wonderful comparison because there's a lot of equivalence between the two groups in question. The only difference really in that context would be one started, say, in co-rec and the other was in standalone. And they both have a shared outcome. They both have very similar GPA. That would be a very strong comparison. The only piece I would add, of course, are to exam before you move forward with the direct comparison moving forward, be sensitive also to, of course, already GPA, but the other demographic characteristics like ethnicity and others that you may have access to in your data. Because if you find there to be other differences, you want to make sure that you can, using a statistical model like we talked about here, account for some of those differences as you progress forward and examine what those differences may be in that next course. That's a great comparison.
Right. And we were just in this, so they're saying, and I was just trying to reframe the question. So another comment came in, not necessarily similar GPAs, but that's a way that you could look at students who didn't pass, right? Is now you're breaking them down by students who didn't pass in co-requisite and didn't pass in transfer level by similar GPAs and even adding other demographics like the ethnicity, and then tracking those students. If you have a large enough N, so you may need to do it over like a year or 2 years, so that you have a larger sample size, and then tracking their outcomes. So if those students in transfer level retook transfer level, what was their outcome? Or if those students in transfer level went to a co-requisite, what was their outcome? And is there any variation between those groups based on where they went next?
Exactly. I love that. Thank you for that. Absolutely right. And the GPA is still pertinent, I would say, because the GPA, high school GPA, may have bearing on, for lack of a better term, resilience. It's possible, and obviously I'm speculating, but there might be literature suggesting that those with higher GPAs are more likely to demonstrate a degree of resilience in spite of failure, because in part, and this is my own thinking here, I don't have an article I could cite here, but my thinking here is they've done so well in high school, maybe they've experienced failure and in that context demonstrated resilience, and that's how they got to where they are now in their career. So my point, I suppose, is high school GPA is still a relevant factor to control and just about any comparison that honestly I can think of, because of its strong relationship to success, because of its strong relationship to so many outcomes that our students experience.
Mm-hmm. And then another great question is, when you were talking about the regression analysis, you're giving that example. And the question is, what if high school GPA and the co-rec are highly correlated, that there's multicollinearity in the regression model? What should you do in that case? Excellent
point. The first thing I would say is it depends on how strongly they're related. If and I heard the term multicollinearity. If we're talking about multicollinearity, what that means, and this is for those of you that may be less statistically inclined, so I'll go back to this diagram. Multicollinearity means you're looking at co-rec in high school. What that means is they're one and the same. Co-rec, let's try to do this visual transformation with me there at home. Let's move co-rec down here, or vice versa, high school up here, to the point where they're on top of each other. They're on top. If it gets to that point, if it gets to that point where they're on top of each other, at that point it doesn't matter, right? You can remove one. You should remove one of them, but at that point it won't matter which one you remove, because they share that same unique relationship with throughput. At that point, what you're saying is it doesn't matter whether it's GPA or co-requisite, because in fact, maybe there's little value to making that, at least at your college, little value to making a distinction, because co-rec is so intricately connected to high school GPA. It doesn't matter. Great question. Great question. And of course, this is hypothetical. You may find drastically different relationships when you look at this figure or something akin to this at your college.
And then another question that came in is, what's the advantage of using a proportionality index over just comparing the outcomes among groups? So what's the value added of calculating proportionality index?
So what I'm hearing then, and I didn't hear the terminology, but what I'm sensing here is, say, relative to, say, and I'm going to use jargon here, so I apologize, but I think many of you will follow. To say using another method for disproportionate impact, PPG -1 or percentage point gap -1, the advantage, I don't know if there's one advantage in one versus the other, but what I would say is look at both. If you can calculate both, absolutely look at both and look for consistency across the two methods. In my experience, the PI, proportionality index method, is a little bit more conservative. And what I mean by that is, generally, and I haven't done any systematic testing to be able to say with high degree of certainty, it is more conservative all the time. But in my experience, it can be, and what I mean by conservative, it's a little bit less likely to show an instance of disproportionate impact than, say, a comparison between your target population, say Hispanic Latinx students, relative to other students, which would be consistent with the PPG -1 method. So I don't know that I would say there's an advantage to one. Maybe the one advantage I would argue is conceptually. When you're explaining this to your audiences, if you explain it and say using terms that I use, and this is just my own bias here, I think it's a concept that resonates with folks, the representation or lack of representation of student populations among successful, say, degree earners or those that are successful in achieving throughput. I think there's a concept there that is one that can readily resonate with audience. But I would say in practice, consider doing both. If you have access to the data allowing you to do both methods, look at both and look for consistency across the two approaches. Great question. Yeah, great questions. Friday morning. Let's do it.
Yeah. And then we just had quite a few comments that people were looking for content of what is in co-requisites and what kind of are some best practices or things that lead to higher completion. So I just will note that the IRPE group, the multi-measure assessment project, we are working on a full analysis of co-requisite courses, and that will be coming out in the fall. So we are looking at different factors within co-requisite, so more of that to be looked at. But the two studies I did link to for PPIC, that has in-depth analysis of co-requisites. But as Gio mentioned, they don't have access to the high school GPA data, which we do. So more to come on that. And I know that some of our colleagues, CAP has had some webinars around content of co-requisites as well. And of course, the Strengthening Student Success Conference in the fall of every year will have a lot of content around co-requisites, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mallory. Absolutely.
All right. We have 4 minutes left. Just want to thank everyone for coming. We will be posting this recording and the PowerPoint on the IRPE group website. I did link it in the chat for those of you that want to pull it down before you take off. But again, thank you so much for being here on Friday. And Gio, fantastic. Thank you for walking through this. I always learn from you, so I appreciate your time and willingness to jump on to our webinars.
Thank you.
A lot of thank yous in the chat coming in to you, Gio.
Oh, thank you all. Thanks for coming. I just it's wonderful to see this kind of turn out. Just awesome. Thank you all.
I had wanted to make a comment about the I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my video on here.
Sure.
I'm sorry. So I wanted to make a comment about the impact of high school GPA a number of years out from high school, and what data I did see suggests, and I think that Mallory, you noted this in the chat, but even many years out, there's still a very strong impact And I think, and you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but the limitation was really a function of the data, because we kept hearing, well, up to 10 years out, there's an impact, but you only had data 10 years out. And had you had data for 11, 12, 13, 15, 20, we don't know what you'd see, but there's no reason to suspect that the deterioration would have dropped off dramatically after 10 years. And so it's still a good predictor is the point I'm trying to get to, even after 8, 10, and there's no reason not to think 12 or 15 years. It's still good.
Yeah,
Thank
great
you
point,
for
Michael. Yep.
excellent. Thank you for adding that. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.